Well, good morning and Shabbat Shalom. I'm Rabbi Ed Feinstein. This is Beth Shalom Torah study for a Shabbos morning. Joined this morning by my dear friend, colleague, Rabbi Marc Gellman of South Florida. And this morning, Rabbi Hirsch, our friend and colleague, is taking the Shabbos with her family. And we would like to welcome our guest, Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin, also of South Florida, of West Palm Beach. Jeff is a very, very well-known author in the Jewish community and a very, very dear friend. Jeffrey, welcome. It's wonderful to have you learning
Eddie,
Torah
it's great
together
to be
this morning.
here. Mark, it's great to be with you as well. Thanks for having me.
Well, gentlemen, this morning we take off into the wilderness. This morning, Jacob, our ancestor, our patriarch, our namesake, leaves home, running away from his murderous brother, his manipulative mother, and his clueless father, leaves home and goes out into the wilderness of no place. Finds himself in a place completely desolate, puts a rock on the ground and sleeps on a rock. What kind of man sleeps on a rock? When I was in Boy Scout camp, they taught us that you take out a towel or you take out a sweatshirt and you sleep on that, or you sleep on your knapsack. But a man who sleeps on a rock is a man who is totally exposed, totally open to the elements, to the exigencies of life with no protection. He left home, not even a sweater. His mother didn't even make him put on a sweater, right? It's before Jewish mothers got into that habit. They learned their lesson, you know? And he finds himself in the middle of nowhere and he has his dream. And the God of his ancestors appears to him in this dream and says, "You're mine. I will take care of you on this journey. I will bring you back." He sees ladder of angels coming up and down. And with that dream in mind, he proceeds to the old country, back to Mesopotamia, where the family comes, where he meets his Beshert, he meets Rachel, and the drama of the next generation of the family begins. Marc, what's it like to take that journey out into the middle of nowhere, to leave mom and dad, to leave home, to leave everything you know and everything that identifies you and protects you, and sleep out in the middle of nowhere with nothing but a rock for a pillow?
It was after 9/11. I was the president of the New York Board of Rabbis during that fateful time. And I did so many memorial services, some with Tom Hartman, some myself. And at one of them, a little girl comes up to me and she had lost her father in the towers. And we were talking about how she felt. And she looked at me and she said, "Well, I still have my friend. I still have God as my friend." And to her, that was the essence of her faith, that even without her father, she still had God as her friend. And I think that's exactly the kind of awareness that Jacob comes to, that when all around you crumbles and you have no one you can trust and you're sunk in the depths, you still have God.
You know, Eddie, you said something a few moments ago, and I thank you, Mark, for that understanding that you still have God. I remember reading a book years ago that said that life without emotional risk is merely housekeeping.
Mm-hmm.
And something that you said that really struck home: spiritual life, the religious life, radical vulnerability. And that the journey stories that we find in Genesis are of people who really do go into the unknown. These really are stories of adventure. Not for nothing do the Hasidic teachers think that these are really allegories for the inward journey as well as the outward journey. So I'm going to suggest that be able to sleep on a rock is leave yourself open to everything that's outside of you, everything that's within you. And without that, living in a sanctuary of safety doesn't bring you to God.
There's a phrase in the Torah that is kind of wonderful. It says Jacob, heads out of home and vayifga b'makom. The translation, I think, is something like he comes across a place. But of course, it's such a ripe phrase, first of all, Vayifga doesn't mean he came across it. It sort of means it bumped into him. He stumbled across it. And makom, of course, is a code word for the divine. Marc, what does that mean, Vayifga b'makom?
Yeah, I think it's the most profound teaching about our encounters with God from the Torah, the most profound, which is you meet God by bumping into God. You don't meet God by appointment. You don't meet God on Shabbos because that's when God has marked out God's calendar to go and meet with you. You don't meet with God on Tuesday afternoons when you're free. You meet with God when you bump into God in places that seem so completely unlikely. A bush that's burning but isn't consumed is an unlikely place to meet God. And yet, that's where Moses bumps into God. And so you have this encounter with God at a place which turns out to be a cultic center, Bethel. And what you need to bump into God, that's the interesting thing to me. You need to have patience, and you need to have open eyes and open ears to be able to know that you're bumping into God. Otherwise, you just move on and you miss it. That is, a bush that's burning but isn't consumed, you can't tell that right away. I think Larry Kushner made that point first, which is, how do you know it isn't being consumed unless you sit there and watch it? So patience is a key thing in bumping into God. The other is that you have to be open to this notion of makom, that the world is the place of God, but God is not the place of the world. That is, God is bigger than the world, but the world is in God. So it means that there is no alien place where you can't meet God. You can meet God in Auschwitz. You could meet God, in places that are more traditional. But one of the things we have to get people to overcome in attending shul is that that's where they go to meet God. And that's just not it. It's like the old, was it a Henny Youngman joke? He goes to me, I go to shul on Shabbos. Goldberg, he talks to God. I go to shul to meet Goldberg. And that's the idea, that you don't meet God in preordained places. You meet God in places where it just happens. And I'm curious about you guys and when you have ever felt in your life that without preparation, without expectation, you bumped into God.
Before I answer that question, I'm going to push back just a little bit. Here we are, we're three rabbis. Cumulatively, we have about 150 years of rabbinic experience. Our livelihoods and our professional life were based, I think, on some level, on a routinization of the encounter with God. In other words, Marc, what you're experiencing, what you're expressing, is that word, that term, that ubiquitous expression of spirituality. But can we say that religiosity, ritual, tefillah, seder, siddur, is about trying to make the unpredictable predictable?
Yeah, good way to say it. Good way to say it. But I don't think it does that. And I don't think that's its purpose. I don't think the purpose of davening is to meet God. The purpose of davening is to connect to the people in the community and reaffirm your own sense of beliefs in God.
Well, the other thing it strikes me interesting is that the character of Jacob that we met last week, was the manipulator even before he was born. Here was a soul who thought he could control everything. He could manipulate the birth the birth order in the family. He could manipulate the father. He could manipulate the brother. The mother was a little more manipulative. We'll come back to her. He's that character who thinks he's in charge of everything. He's running everything. And all of a sudden, Vayifga b'makom, he discovers that life is going to happen to him and that he's the object, no longer the subject of the story. And what happens to a person when they lose that control? And there, Jeff, I would suggest that maybe our role is that we are the ones who are there when life runs into somebody or runs over somebody, when life just whomps somebody and they're reeling because they realize that the drama is bigger than them and that they don't control all the conditions of their own existence. And they're trying to find some sense of meaning and order and direction in a world that has suddenly vayifga b'makom, has suddenly overcome them. And that's the drama that we as rabbis deal with. How many times have we sat with a family that's just suffered a loss, a terrible loss, and tried to help them understand it because it's so beyond their experience, because this was something that was unpredictable, unpredicted, and unprepared for. Or how many times have we sat with a couple that has fallen in love? Vayifga b'makom. Love came down upon them, right? And so the question, it's this really interesting meditation on how you live with the events of life that you're not ready for. Now, let's take a step forward. You ready? So here's Jacob, the manipulator, the guy who thinks he's in control. And not only vayifga b'makom, but once he gets to Mesopotamia, the first thing that happens to him is he loses himself in love. Here comes his cousin Rachel, and he is smitten. It's a wonderful word, by the way. And of course, the image here is there's this giant rock that they keep on top of the well in order to protect the water from the shepherds. And all by himself, he pushes the rock off the mouth of the well, which, as Jeffrey said, in the Hasidic tradition, everything is introjected. This is the journey, the inner journey of the hero, not just the outer journey. And the rock off the well is a rock off of his heart. And his heart opens up and he is completely taken with love. And that's when he meets his cousin, his uncle Lavan. The Hebrew word Lavan means white. And white in French is blanc, to be blank. If the Torah knew better, it would call him poker-faced. The capacity of a human being to hide his true feelings, his true emotions, and to present an external which is completely unrelated to the internal. And Jacob, the manipulator, meets the master manipulator, his uncle Laban. So Jeffrey, tell me about Uncle Laban, and tell me about why this story is told, and tell me about why we include this narrative in our family narrative. Who wants to talk about the Ganef in the family? Why is this here?
So I've been trying to figure this one out. I call it the deception gene. And certainly Jacob has it. He shows that from before his birth. But you see, Jacob is the son of Rebecca, who's really good at deception as well. And I'm going to say that she gets it from her brother Lavan. And we don't know about Bethuel, we don't know about Nahor, but there's something in that part of the family that is skilled at the art of deception. And Jacob's sons will get it, okay? They will deceive Jacob when they bring the bloody coat of Joseph to him. They will deceive the people of Shechem when they demand, after the rape or seduction of Dinah, that they become circumcised. And then Joseph gets it as well, because Joseph deceives his brothers in Egypt. And then Tamar, she's not really part of the family, but she gets it by osmosis. She deceives Judah. I keep saying to myself that there is something, sadly, about this piece of the story that says that you need a little diaspora. Jews have always had to live by their wits. And I'm wondering to what extent many of these stories exist as diaspora stories. Now, the story of Jacob hanging with Lavan, that is the quintessential story of the Jew in diaspora. Next week when Jacob is recounting his life, he says, Im Lavan Garti, I hung out with Lavan. Garti, which Rashi says is actually the numerical value of 613. Even though I hung out with him, I observed all the mitzvot. That's how you want to live. But in reality, haven't we learned that you have to keep your wits about you?
So this is Fagin and Oliver. You've got to pick a pocket or two.
About that?
Mm-hmm.
Reassociation. In the novel Oliver Twist, Fagin is always called the Jew, the old Jew. The original illustrations are like out of Der Stürmer. They're classic anti-Semitic illustrations. Fast forward to the musical Oliver, which even though it was written by a Jew, and even though every high school does it, Fagin is not referred to in the musical as a Jew, but every song that Fagin sings is in a minor key and has a musical scale that is reminiscent of klezmer. Everyone else gets songs in the major key. I just had to say that.
That I didn't know. That's wonderful. So this notion that in diaspora, we have to master the art of deception, or that deception is a survival skill for the Jew in diaspora.
I don't like it either. I don't like it.
I can't handle this anymore. I can't. I don't.
Come on, Marc.
Look, some of this is ancient Near Eastern. You even see it in the Greek epics. This is poking out the eye of the Cyclops. Who did this? No man did it. My name is No Man. It's sort of craftiness, shrewdness. It was a culturally approved virtue in the ancient world. Okay, let's put that there. But there are other stories about Jews that don't lead to the support of the anti-Semitic meme that we're now fighting in America on many and many different levels. Jews are crafty, Jews are sneaky, Jews will cheat you. The one I remember most is the story of Beer Sontheimer, who was the largest seller of copper to the British Empire. And it was a British Jewish family, and during World War I, they got a memo when the war broke out: we'll buy all your stocks of copper because we need them for bullets. And they were observant, and so they didn't answer it on Shabbos. And after Shabbos was over, there's like 10 memos, each raising the price of copper, figuring that they were just silent. The War Department felt they were silent because they were rejecting the bid. So the final bid was like triple what they had originally bid. Mr. Beer called back and said, "We accept your first bid." Because it wasn't that we were trying to negotiate. We were observing the Sabbath, and it would be unfair for us to profit on the Sabbath. And because of that, they turned out to have all the contracts for all the precious metals for the War Department, for that and for World War II, and became a multi-billion pound company. So that's the kind of Jewish story that I want to tell about Jewish businessmen. I don't want to in any way reinforce this notion you have to have a little ganef in you. I don't like it.
But you know what's interesting?
I don't like it.
I did a careful study of these deception stories, even the root of the word Ramah, guile, and I discovered something. After the book of Genesis, they don't exist anymore. There are no more stories of deception anymore in the entire Tanakh. It's like we had to wean this out of our personalities. This really supports what Marc is saying. This was not a good stage. We had to get rid of this.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, excuse me for being the moralist here, but it seems to me that, and for being a sort of simple moralist, but what the story is really doing is showing Jacob what it's like to be on the other side of deception. He is the manipulator. He instrumentalizes and commodifies every relationship. Every relationship is transactional. He says to his brother, I'll sell you the stew, give me your birthright. Transactional. Messes with the father who's blind, giving the blessing. Transactional. Shows up to Laban. Laban is the ultimate transactionalist. And Jacob then discovers just what it means to be messed with when he wakes up in the morning with the wrong woman. The girl he loves, he has to work another 7 years for. And he suddenly discovers what it's like. And as we finish this story, I'll give you a preview of coming attractions. Next week, he's going to return to Eretz Yisrael. He's going to have to confront his brother. And you know what he's thinking. You know that he's thinking some way to weasel out of the confrontation, some way to escape from the mess that he left behind, some way to manipulate the brother that he's been manipulating his whole life. And that night he wrestles with an angel. And wrestling is the opposite of manipulation, because the other has a hold on you. It's a full-on confrontation with life. And the image that the hero, like the great sage Joseph Campbell taught us, the hero's journey. He goes on this journey, and on the journey, it's a journey within as well as a journey without. And he discovers his soul, and he discovers that you don't go through life manipulating. And every subsequent story of manipulation turns out badly. The story of Shechem turns out badly. The story of the Joseph and the brothers turns out badly. And the idea of the Torah is that this is not the way. At least this is not the way that if you want to create a society where people can live together, you can't do this. This is not the way. This is not the way. Let's look at that one story before we complete this section of the Torah, because it's just such a delicious story. So he's in love with Rachel. And he bargains for 7 years, works 7 years for Rachel. And the night of the wedding, the girls are switched. And suddenly he discovers himself with Leah. And Leah knows that she was not the one who was loved. Leah knows that she is the marriage of convenience. She knows it because as she begins to birth children, each of them are named. The names of these children are the levels of desperation to which she falls. Ruvain means my husband will see me and will finally love me. Shimon means my husband will hear my pain and finally come to my aid. Levi means my husband will accompany me. And it's only when she gets to Yehuda, the fourth of the kids, which means that she has matched the number of kids in the whole family. Sarah had 1. Rebecca had 2. She's now had 4. Yehuda this is my thanks to God for giving me such bounty. But the pain of this poor woman, and then slowly you see something interesting happen. You begin to see him paying attention to her, and not because of her fertility, but because there's some other qualities about her. Gentlemen, talk to me about marriage. Talk to me about the Leah, the Rachel that men fall in love with, and the Leah that they turn to and discover life with. Talk to me about marriage for a second.
Well, look, I've been married to Rachel for steady 54 years, and it was just her patience with living with an old dog like me. Even when I was young, I was an old dog. And I think that there's 2 elements. Jung helps us understand that in his theory of archetypes in women. And we saw it back in Lilith and Eve. You see it, there's 2 archetypes of women. One is the seductress, the sexual allure, the physical beauty. And the Torah is not beyond dipping into that. And I'm not particularly proud of the fact that it succumbs to beautyism. Like when it calls Leah one with the weak eyes, it means she was ugly. And it says it in the Torah, she was ugly. And who cares if she's ugly? What difference does that make? But partly we fall in love at the beginning with Lilith, with physical beauty. But later, we understand that there's a generative productivity, there's a creative birthing quality to women that is so far beyond anything men can understand and even appreciate. And that's Leah, and that's the quality that produces something that isn't rambunctious, but is stable, something that isn't impetuous, but is loyal. Men are not hardwired to be that way. So I think that there is a complementarity. We need to fall in love with beauty, but we need to marry Leah.
And the maturity that it takes to recognize that,
Well,
the change within the masculine archetype, the contrary corresponding masculine archetypes, that and the journey of the masculine archetype from one to the other.
it's a big deal. It's a big deal for men to transition from one to the other, and many don't do it well. You know, it's really, really hard. When I talk to brides and grooms, and so I first ask, what do you love about each other? It's such a simple, stupid question, but what I'm listening for are, do they pick physical attributes or do they pick qualities of their soul? And when I hear, I love her because of the way she treats children, the way she treats my family, the way she treats her friends, then I know that they're in love with the person's soul. When they say, oh, look at her, she's so hot, you know, I said, okay, you know, this isn't a good thing. So I think that there is a challenge, and it's really primarily a challenge for men to respect beauty of women, but to also respect their generative qualities, their creative qualities, their birthing qualities, and their partnership. Remember in the Sheva Brachos, it's Re'im Ahuvim, that what we're praying for a couple is that they should be loving friends, not just passionate lovers, but loving friends. And I think that's the transition the Torah is trying to urge us to consider at a time when such considerations were unknown.
Jeffrey, the Torah portion, the arc of this Torah portion is Jacob's journey. It starts with him leaving home, and it ends with him returning home. It starts with him as the manipulator, and it ends with him. Well, tell me, what is the transition? What is the most important piece of transition in the character of this man? I guess the Torah portion really is about 21 years, really, because if that's how long he's in exile. What happens to this man in 21 years, and how is he different at the end?
I think, Eddie, that what has happened is the rough pieces of Jacob have had to have been filed down in the experience of living with Lavan. You know, there's that wonderful phrase that the purpose of the mitzvot are litzaref et habriyot. And seruf, litzaref, means to smelt out the impurity, like which you would find in metal. And I think that you might even refer to the experience with Lavan as the long, dark night of the soul, which, by the way, next week, Jacob will really go through when he's involved with this nocturnal, middle of the night wrestling match with either Jacob, God, an angel of God, or as everyone is fond of imagining, with Jacob himself. So I think that the experience with Lavan has held up a mirror to Jacob where he gets to see his own personality. And I'll say something else about the name Lavan. You correctly said it means white, but it also comes from Livana, from the moon. And one thing we know, or think we know about our ancestors back in Haran, back in Padan Aram, back in Aram Naharayim back in Mesopotamia is that they seem to have found meaning in the phases of the moon. And we've imported that fascination with the moon into our own lives and into our own calendar system. I think that Jacob, looking at Lavan, looking at Levana, looking at the moon, sees, forgive me, the craters in his own personality and realizes that he too must go through phases. And that he emerges from this experience most likely a more decent person. It's also, by the way, I think from a literary point of view, that whole experience is a dress rehearsal for the enslavement in Egypt and the exodus from Egypt. And Jacob has to go through that experience as a way of preparing his descendants for that as well.
Wonderful. So before we finish, let's jump away from the Torah for just a moment, back into our contemporary moment. This past week, we celebrated Kaf Tet b'November, the 29th of November. The 29th of November, 1947, the United Nations voted to partition Palestine, essentially to create both a Jewish and a Palestinian national home in Palestine. The vote was 33 votes for, 13 votes against, and 10 abstentions. And the question is, and that was the moment that the world recognized that the Jewish people needs to return home and has a right, a moral right to its homeland, to build a home in the land of Israel. What's the significance? We look back at 75 years this year. This is the 75th year of that vote. And in May, we'll celebrate the 75th Yom HaAtzmaut. Jeffrey talk so beautifully about the transition, about the journey, about facing yourself and learning and growing. So what has 75 years of sovereignty, as it were, taught us as a Jewish people?
I reflected on it this week and I said that if everything you had said, Eddie, had come true, this also would have been the 75th anniversary of the creation of a Palestinian state. Though in 1947, to be fair, the notion of a Palestinian identity was still very much in flux, and I don't think anyone called that state that could have been created Palestine. In fact, I plead ignorance. I don't even know what the proposed name of that state had been. We've been living with the consequences of Arab rejectionism of that decision ever since. But if I can get a little political, I do have to say that a piece of me is tearing my clothing right now. And when I see the coalition partners that, yes, we're democratically elected, democracy is not the point here, but people like Smotrich and Ben Gvir, frankly, I worry. I worry. I am losing sleep over what it will mean for us to have bona fide bigots, racists in this government. And I worry about what this is going to mean to the relationship between American Jews and Israel. I celebrate Kaf Tet b'November. I celebrate the 75th anniversary. It takes a lot more than Smotrich and Ben Gvir to dampen my Zionism, but I'm worried. It's what Jews do. I am an aerobic worrier.
Marc, how have we changed in 75 years? Well, I think it comes down to a symbolism. In Rome, there's the Arch of Titus, and there's a frieze on the Arch of Titus in Rome near the Colosseum, celebrating the destruction of the temple in the year 70 by Titus, and it was the general, then he became the emperor. And there's a picture of the menorah there, and on this day, 1947, the day after, a group of Jews went to the Arch of Titus, which ever since it was erected, there was a Jewish custom that Jews would never walk under the Arch of Titus because it shows the Jews in captivity, and the maxim in Latin under it was Judea captor est, Judea is captive. So Jews would never walk under the Arch of Titus. But on this day, 75 years ago, a group of Jews gathered and they walked under the Arch of Titus the other way. Not from Judea to Rome, but from Rome to Judea. And I think it comes down to that. All of a sudden, without any rational belief that this would ever happen, we turned around. Out of a world that was powerless into a world of power. Out of a world that was stateless to a world with a Jewish state. Out of a world where diaspora was our only reality to a world in which diaspora was one of two realities. And to turn around and walk under the Arch of Titus the other way is something no people has ever had a chance to do, except us. And I believe that that turning around is the greatest event in Jewish history since the event described on the arch above those who walk.
That's beautiful. Thank you. Thank you both. I'll just add one small note. There's a scholar named Harry Austen Wolfson who studied Judaism in Lithuania and the yeshivas of Lithuania. Was a genius. He came to America at the beginning of the 20th century and took a PhD at Harvard, and then became the first Jewish studies professor. I believe he's the first Jewish studies professor in American secular university at Harvard, beginning of the 20th century. And today, every major American university has a Jewish studies teacher, a professor, even a program, PhDs. The idea that an American university with the stature of Harvard could recognize Jewish culture as legitimate, as not a parasitical culture, as not a degenerate culture, as not an aberration, but something legitimate to be celebrated and studied and mastered in a place like Harvard, was a very, very big moment. Because until that point, Jewish culture was always considered some very marginal to European culture, and frankly, degenerate, something that wasn't worthy of serious scholarly study outside of our own kinds of study of it. The world never recognized it. Wolfson's election to the professorship at Harvard recognized something about who we are. The vote in 1947 did something similar to Jewish peoplehood. The world said, you are a people, and you must stand with all the peoples of the world, the nations of the world, as a full member of the human community, as a member of the human community deserving of dignity and sovereignty and self-determination, and that you are not a parasitic culture, you are not a degenerate culture, you're not a mistake. You're not a mistake, and no other culture has ever taken your place in the world. No one else can claim to be the new Israel or the real Israel. You are Israel, and you are the Jewish people, and you deserve to stand proudly as a member of the people. When I was a little kid, and we used to visit the UN or any other place where there were flags of the world, and Israel's flag flew among them, it made us very excited. We count, we exist, and the world now recognizes and acknowledges that. And that is a tremendous change in the status of the Jewish people. Like Jeffrey, I worry. You're exactly right. We always worry. But nothing can take away the great, remarkable miracle of our recognition by the peoples of the world. Thank you to Rabbi Jeffrey Salkin of South Florida, our guest this morning. Thank you to my dear friend and teacher, Rabbi Gellman, and a good Shabbos to Rabbi Hirsch, enjoying a wonderful Shabbos with her family. This morning, following our Torah study, of course, you're welcome to join us for Sabbath prayer here at Valley Beth Shalom. And this week, we complete our study of the philosophy of Abraham Joshua Heschel on Wednesday night at 7 o'clock. Please look for us in person or here online. Hope that you're having a wonderful, wonderful, wonderful beginning of December. Please remember that there are only 23 more shopping days until Hanukkah. So get something pretty for the people that you love, and have a very good Shabbos. Shabbat Shalom, gentlemen.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom. Thanks, everyone. Bye.